All right, ready to dive into something totally different. We're checking out this Taiwanese podcast, John Chat. Let's chat with John. Episode 17, to be exact.
Ooh, what's the draw?
Well, the host, Professor John, is kind of a big deal.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He teaches at National Taiwan Normal University.
Professor, huh?
And get this, he won the Golden Bell Award for Best Host in 2024.
The Golden Bell Award.
Yeah, think of it like the Taiwanese Emmys for radio.
Wow, so he's not just a professor, he's a celebrity professor.
Pretty much. And this episode is even more special because it's the first in a brand new series called Yi-Wei Chat.
Yi-Wei Chat, okay.
Yeah, he has his friend Dr. Yi-Wei Chen on as a guest.
And who is Dr. Chen?
He is an expert in Japanese history. And they just spent the whole episode chatting about all sorts of fascinating stories and unofficial history from Japan.
Unofficial history, like the stuff you don't find in textbooks.
Exactly. And they're super casual about it, too, like they're just hanging out.
Always more fun to learn that way, right?
I know, right? Sipping red wine, enjoying Taiwanese snacks.
Sounds like my kind of history lesson.
They even filmed it for YouTube Live, if you want to see all the visuals.
Oh, cool. I always like to see people's reactions as they're talking.
Me too. And they don't edit anything out. It's totally raw and authentic.
The best way to learn, in my opinion. It feels more genuine, you know?
Right. You get to hear those spontaneous thoughts and reactions.
Exactly. So what kind of unofficial history are we talking about?
Well, Dr. Chen starts off by saying that if you really want to appreciate Japanese culture, you've got to understand its history.
That makes sense. History gives context to everything.
Yeah, and he should know he spent a year studying in Kyoto.
Wow! Kyoto. That's like the heart of traditional Japan.
Exactly. He even shared this really cool story about how Japanese schools really emphasize community over individual achievement.
Oh, I've heard about that. It's a pretty big contrast to a lot of Western cultures, isn't it?
It is. Like, he said there was this one time when a class was planning a trip to Canada.
Okay.
But one of the students couldn't afford it. So what did they do? The whole class decided to take a cheaper trip within Japan instead, just so everyone could go.
Wow, that's incredible. They really value inclusivity, don't they?
They do. They prioritize the group experience over individual desires.
That's a powerful lesson. I wonder if it's something we could learn from in the West.
Yeah, it's definitely food for thought. And it really sets the stage for what Dr. Chen talks about next, the Sengoku period, or, as it's also known, the Warring States period.
Ah, yes. A time of samurai and power struggles.
A classic period in Japanese history.
It is. And to help break it all down, Dr. Chen uses this really clever analogy. He compares the three most famous warlords from this period, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, to the hierarchy of a company.
Okay, now I'm really interested. How does that work?
So he says Oda Nobunaga is like the powerful CEO, the one who's trying to unify all the different departments under his control.
So in this case, the departments are like the different provinces of Japan?
Exactly. And Oda Nobunaga was this close to actually unifying all of Japan.
Wow, that's ambitious. It is. But then, things took a really dramatic turn with the Hanaji incident.
Hanaji, that rings a bell. Wasn't that where?
Yep, that's where Oda Nobunaga was betrayed and killed by one of his own subordinates, Akechi Mitsuhide. And tragically, his son died in the incident too.
That's right. Such a pivotal moment in Japanese history. A real turning point.
It was. And that's where our next warlord, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, enters the picture.
Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The one who rose from humble beginnings to become the leader of Japan.
That's the one. And in Dr. Chen's company analogy, he's kind of like that ambitious subordinate who sees an opportunity.
Oh, I see where this is going. He seized the moment after Oda Nobunaga's death.
Exactly. He was actually nicknamed Monkey because of his humble origins. Some stories even say he was a sandal bearer before rising to power.
Wow, from sandal bearer to leader of Japan, that's quite a journey.
It is. And you're not going to believe this, but when he heard about Oda Nobunaga's death, he literally ran for 3 days straight to get back to Kyoto and claim leadership.
3 days. He must have been determined. Talk about seizing the moment.
Right. And he didn't stop there. To solidify his power, he made Osaka his capital.
Osaka, like the Osaka we know today.
The one and only. It's amazing to think that this bustling city was once the center of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's power.
It really adds another layer to exploring Osaka, knowing that history.
I know, right? But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the twist?
Well, remember that company analogy Dr. Chen used? It actually leads to a pretty wild conspiracy theory about Toyotomi Hideyoshi.
A conspiracy theory. I'm all ears.
Some people believe that he might have actually been the one who orchestrated Oda Nobunaga's assassination.
Wait, what? He had his own boss killed? Why would he do that?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The thinking is that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the one who benefited most from Nobunaga's death. So maybe, just maybe, he had a hand in it.
Wow, that's a bold claim. It definitely throws a wrench in the traditional narrative.
Yes, it does. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about this period.
Exactly. And it shows how history is often more complex and nuanced than we initially think.
Absolutely, and that's what makes exploring these what-if scenarios so fascinating.
It's like a historical puzzle trying to piece together all the different motives and possibilities.
It really is. And speaking of Osaka...
Right. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's capital.
Exactly. It's famous for Osaka Castle, which Toyotomi Hideyoshi built as a symbol of his power.
Ah, Osaka Castle. It's such an iconic landmark. I've always wanted to visit.
It's definitely a must-see. And Dr. Chen mentions a detail that I thought was really interesting. He said that the gourd is the symbol of the Toyotomi clan.
A gourd? That's kind of random, isn't it?
It is, but it's thought to be connected to Toyotomi Hideyoshi's humble beginnings.
Right, we were talking about how he may have been a sandal bearer earlier in his life.
Exactly. Imagine walking for miles as a sandal bearer. You'd need something to carry water.
True.
And a gourd would have been a perfect, readily available option.
Ah, I see. So it represents his resourcefulness and his journey from those humble beginnings to the top.
Precisely. And it's a detail you can actually look for when you visit Osaka. You'll see gourd symbols all over the city, especially around Osaka Castle.
I love that. It's like a little historical scavenger hunt.
It is. And speaking of Osaka Castle, Dr. Chen mentioned this recent movie called The Princess of Toyotomi that imagines a secret Toyotomi dynasty living beneath the castle.
Wait, a secret dynasty living under Osaka Castle? Now that's a story I want to hear.
It's a fictional story, of course, but it imagines this hidden world where the Toyotomi bloodline has continued for centuries, protecting a hidden treasure and upholding their ancestors' legacy.
That's so creative. It really shows how these figures from the Sengoku period still capture the imagination of people today.
They do. And it makes you wonder how much of history is still hidden, waiting to be discovered or reimagined.
It's a reminder that history is always evolving, and there are always new stories to uncover.
Exactly. And now that we've covered Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, that leaves us with one more major player in this period.
Tokugawa Ieyasu, the one who eventually brought lasting peace to Japan and established a dynasty that lasted for centuries.
The very same. And he's a fascinating character in his own right.
I bet. He had to have been pretty incredible to succeed where others had failed.
Who was. But unlike the ambition and drive of Oda Nobunaga or the opportunistic rise of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu is described as being incredibly patient and strategic.
Ah, so he was playing the long game.
Exactly. He started out as an ally to both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, but he was always observing, waiting for the right moment to make his move.
Sounds like he had a keen understanding of power dynamics.
He did. And when the time was right, he used his skills as a military leader to finally bring peace to Japan after years of conflict.
And in doing so, he established the Tokugawa shogunate, a dynasty that would rule Japan for over 250 years.
It's a remarkable feat, and it really speaks to his leadership abilities. He was able to create stability and unity where others had only found chaos.
And I bet that patient, strategic nature that Dr. Chen mentioned played a big part in his success.
I think you're right. It makes you think about how different leadership styles can be effective in different situations.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that Dr. Chen draws a connection between these warlords and modern Japanese society.
Oh.
He suggests that many of the values embodied by these warlords, things like ambition, strategy, and a focus on the collective good, can still be seen in Japan today.
Like how Japanese companies often prioritize teamwork and loyalty over individual achievement.
Exactly. It's like those values from the Sengoku period have been passed down through generations.
It's fascinating to think about how these historical figures and events can continue to shape a culture centuries later.
I agree. And it makes exploring Japanese culture even more rewarding.
Speaking of exploring, there's a story that Dr. Chen shared about Toyotomi Hideyoshi that gives us a glimpse into his personality and beliefs.
Oh, tell me more. I love these little anecdotes.
Well, we talked about how the gourd is the symbol of the Toyotomi clan, right?
Right, because of his time as a sandal bearer.
Exactly. But Dr. Chen said that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was actually quite superstitious, and he believed that gourds brought good luck, especially in battle.
Superstitions. Everyone's got them right. Even powerful warlords.
Apparently so. And it gets better. He actually had his soldiers carry gourds into battle with them.
Wait, seriously, an army marching into battle with gourds?
Yep. It must have been quite a sight.
I can only imagine. Whether or not they actually brought any luck, they certainly made a statement.
They did. And it shows how beliefs and symbols can play a powerful role in shaping events.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is full of these unexpected details that make it come alive.
And those details often reveal more about a culture than any textbook ever could.
They do. And they make history so much more engaging and relatable.
Speaking of engaging, I think this podcast is a fantastic example of how learning about history can be both fun and informative.
I agree. It's so refreshing to hear experts just chatting casually about a topic they're passionate about.
And it makes you feel like you're part of the conversation.
Exactly. It's like we're sitting right there with them enjoying the red wine and Taiwanese snacks.
And maybe even learning a thing or two about Japanese history along the way.
Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into this episode, I wanted to circle back to something Dr. Chen mentioned earlier that really struck me.
You mean about Japanese education and their emphasis on community?
Exactly. That story about the class trip to Canada where the entire class chose a cheaper option so that everyone could go, it really stuck with me.
Me too. It's such a powerful example of how their culture prioritizes the collective good over individual desires.
It really makes you think about the different ways that societies can approach education and instill values in their young people.
It does. And it makes me wonder if there are any lessons we can learn from their approach, especially when it comes to fostering a sense of community and shared responsibility.
That's a great question, and it's something I'd love to explore further.
Me too. It's fascinating to think about how different cultural values can shape the way we view the world and interact with each other.
It's all connected, isn't it? History, culture, education, they all play a role in shaping who we are.
And that's what makes exploring these topics so rewarding. We've only just scratched the surface of Japanese history and culture in this deep dive, but it's already given us so much to think about.
It has. And I think it's a great starting point for anyone who's interested in learning more about Japan.
Absolutely. And this podcast is such a fun and accessible way to do just that.
I agree. It's like a window into another culture. And it might even inspire some listeners to plan a trip to Japan someday.
Speaking of trips to Japan, Dr. Chen actually shared some really interesting insights about the cultural significance of certain places, especially in Osaka.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, he talked about how certain symbols and landmarks take on new meaning when you understand their historical context.
Like how seeing gourd symbols all over Osaka suddenly becomes more meaningful when you know about Toyotomi Hideyoshi and his beliefs.
Exactly. And that's what makes exploring a new culture so enriching. You start to see those connections everywhere.
I can't wait to hear more about these cultural insights. I'm already adding Osaka to my travel bucket list.
Me too. And I think Dr. Chen's perspective, as someone who's lived and studied in Japan, adds a really valuable layer to our understanding.
I agree. It's always great to get insights from someone who's experienced a culture firsthand.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to move on to part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good to me. I'm eager to hear more about what Dr. Chen has to share.
Me too. So stay tuned, listeners, because we're just getting started.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Can't wait to dive back in.
Me neither. This is fascinating stuff. So, Osaka, huh? What else did they talk about?
Well, Osaka Castle, of course. Dr. Chen said it was built by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and it became a symbol of his power, like a real statement to everyone else.
Makes sense. Big, imposing castle. Can't miss that.
Right. And then they got into this whole thing about symbols.
Symbols?
Yeah, like how the gourd is the symbol of the Toyotomi clan.
A gourd? What's the story there?
Well, remember how Toyotomi Hideyoshi supposedly started out as a sandal bearer?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Chen said that a gourd would have been the perfect thing for carrying water back then. You know, if you were walking for miles and miles.
Makes sense. Practical and readily available.
Exactly. So it became associated with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, like this symbol of his journey from those humble beginnings to becoming the leader of Japan.
I love that. A simple gourd with such a deep meaning.
And get this, Dr. Chen said you can actually find gourd symbols all over Osaka today, especially around Osaka Castle.
No way! That's
Yeah.
so cool. It's like those symbols are still whispering his story, even after all these years.
It's like a little historical scavenger hunt.
Yeah.
But speaking of Osaka Castle,
Oh, what about it?
Dr. Chen mentioned this movie, The Princess of Toyotomi.
Okay, what's that one about?
It's this fictional story, but it imagines that there's a whole secret Toyotomi dynasty that's been living underneath Osaka Castle for centuries.
Ooh, living under the castle? Like in secret tunnels or something?
Yeah. And they're guarding a hidden treasure and keeping their ancestors' legacy alive.
That is wild. It's like a mix of history and fantasy.
It is, and it makes you wonder, what other secrets are hidden out there? What other stories are waiting to be told?
Right. History is so much more than just dates and names in a textbook.
Okay, so we've talked about Oda Nobunaga, the ambitious one, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the sandal-bearer turned leader. That leaves us with Tokugawa Ieyasu. What's his deal?
Tokugawa Ieyasu, the one who finally brought lasting peace to Japan. He's the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate.
That's right, a dynasty that ruled for over 250 years. How did he do it?
Well, according to Dr. Chen, he was a master of patience and strategy.
So not like the hot-headed Oda Nobunaga.
Not exactly. He started out as an ally to both Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, but he was always observing, waiting for the right opportunity.
So playing the long game, huh?
Exactly. And when the time was right, he struck, using his military skills to unify Japan and bring an end to all the fighting.
And then he established the Tokugawa shogunate.
Yep. A dynasty that would shape Japan for centuries to come.
Wow, it's incredible to think how one person can have such a lasting impact on history.
It really is. And Dr. Chen made a really interesting point about how the values of these three warlords, ambition, strategy, and a focus on the collective good, are still reflected in Japanese society today.
Oh yeah, like how Japanese companies often emphasize teamwork and loyalty over individual achievement.
Exactly. It's like those values from the Sengoku period have been passed down through generations, shaping the way Japanese people work and interact with each other.
It's like those historical events left an imprint on the culture that's still visible today.
And it makes exploring Japanese culture so much more meaningful.
Okay, I've got to hear this story about Toyotomi Hideyoshi. You mentioned it earlier.
Oh, the one about the gourds.
Yeah. What was that all about?
Well, we talked about how the gourd is the symbol of the Toyotomi clan.
Right, because it represented his humble beginnings as a sandal bearer, always carrying water.
Exactly, but there's more to it. Dr. Chen said that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was actually pretty superstitious, and he believed that gourds brought good luck, especially in battle.
No way. Even powerful warlords believe in superstitions.
Apparently so, and it gets even better. He actually had his soldiers carry gourds into battle with them.
What? A whole army marching with gourds?
Yep. Can you imagine what that must have looked like?
Talk about a sight to see. I wonder if their enemies were like, are those gourds?
I know, right? It's hilarious, but it also shows how seriously they took these beliefs and symbols.
And who knows, maybe those gourds did bring them some good luck.
It's possible. Or maybe it was just the power of believing in something that gave them the edge.
Either way, it's a great story, and it shows that history is full of these quirky, unexpected details that make it so much more interesting.
Totally. And I think that's what makes this podcast so engaging. It's not just a dry recitation of facts and dates. It's full of these fun anecdotes and personal insights.
And it really makes you feel like you're getting a glimpse into another culture.
I agree. It's like we're right there with Professor John and Dr. Chen, learning and laughing along with them.
Okay, so we've covered the three big warlords of the Sengoku period. What else did they talk about?
Well, they spent some time discussing how these historical events and figures have actually shaped modern Japanese society.
Oh, right, like how those values of ambition, strategy, and community are still present today.
Exactly. Dr. Chen even talked about how those values show up in the Japanese workplace with the emphasis on teamwork and loyalty.
It's fascinating to think about how those threads of history are woven into the fabric of modern-day Japan.
It really is. And it makes you appreciate the depth and complexity of Japanese culture.
Absolutely. So, are we ready to move on to the final part of our deep dive?
Let's do it. I can't wait to hear what other insights Professor John and Dr. Chen have to share.
All right, listeners, we'll be right back after a quick break.
Stay tuned. There's more to come. All right, so we've talked about the warlords, the symbols, the castles. What else stood out to you from this conversation?
Well, I think one of the most fascinating things was how they connected all this history to modern-day Japan.
Right. Like, it's one thing to learn about these historical figures and events, but it's another thing entirely to see how they've shaped the culture and values of a nation even centuries later.
Totally. And Dr. Chen did such a great job of drawing those connections.
Like, he pointed out how those values we discussed, the ambition, the strategy that focus on the collective, are still evident in Japan today.
Yeah. And it's not just some abstract idea. He gave specific examples, like how Japanese companies really value teamwork and loyalty, which he sees as a direct link back to those values from the Sengoku period.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it? Like, those historical events left such a lasting impact that you can still see their echoes in the way people work and interact with each other today.
I know. It makes you realize that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's still shaping our world in so many ways.
It's a continuous story unfolding all around us.
And I think that's what makes this podcast so special. It's not just about reciting facts and dates. It's about understanding how those events have shaped the world we live in and how they continue to influence us today.
And they do it in such an engaging way, too. Just two friends chatting over drinks and snacks, sharing their passion for Japanese history and culture.
It's so refreshing, and it makes you feel like you're right there with them, learning and discovering along the way.
I agree. And it's inspiring, too. It makes you want to keep exploring and learning to delve even deeper into this fascinating culture.
I know, right? Like, I'm already thinking about all the books I want to read and the places I want to visit Japan.
Me too. And I think that's a testament to how well Professor John and Dr. Chen brought this topic to life.
Absolutely. They managed to make history feel relevant and exciting, and that's no easy feat.
It's a gift, really. They have this ability to share their knowledge in a way that makes you feel like you're part of the discovery process.
It's contagious. And it makes you realize that learning about history can be a truly enriching experience.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into John Chat, what's your biggest takeaway? What's that one thing that really stuck with you?
That's a tough one. There were so many great insights and stories. But I think for me, it's the reminder that history is a living, breathing thing.
Not just some dusty old textbook.
Exactly. It's all around us, shaping our present and influencing our future. And sometimes it just takes a casual conversation between two friends to bring it to life.
I love that. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. So, to our listeners, if you're looking for a fresh perspective on Japanese history and culture, I highly recommend checking out John Chat and its new Yi-Wei Chen series. It's a fun, engaging, and truly enlightening experience.
And who knows, it might even inspire you to plan your own deep dive into the fascinating world of Japan.